Well, welcome everybody. It's good to see we've got such a full house here today. I'm not surprised, because the motion before us is that this house believes that aid and philanthropy hurt public education. And it's a topic which is, I think, as controversial as it is important, and that's why we're all here today. We could be sliding down the flumes or next to the pool outside, and it's pretty tempting, but actually I'd rather be here because I run an organization called PEAS, which is a network of secondary schools, and we benefit from aid, but we also designed a lot of what we do very carefully around some of what we regard as the failures of aid. So it's a topic which is very close personally to my heart, and it's a topic which I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And we all know that aid can create dependency, aid can create market distortions, aid can undermine democratic accountability, but it also creates school places and improves education quality. And so we're very, very privileged today to hear from 4 leading experts on the subject. Proposing the motion, we have Fred Van Leeuwen, who's the General Secretary of Education International, and he'll be seconded by Joel Samoff, who's Professor of History at Stanford University. And against the motion today, we've got Charles Tapp, who's the Head of Partnerships and External Relations for the Global Partnership for Education, and he will be seconded by Tsitsi Maziyiwa, who's the Executive Chairperson of Higher Life Foundation from South Africa. The format of the session is the following. We're going to have an initial vote before you've heard any of the speakers, so we can get a sense of people's biases, should we call them, as you come into the room. We won't see the results of that vote until the end, and at that point we'll have a second vote and we'll see the results of both to be able to compare them. The winner is simply the winner of the second vote, although it'll be interesting to see whether anyone's been budged during the debate itself. Let's hope they are. We're going to have 4 alternating opening statements, and we'll then have about 15 minutes of rebuttal. I might ask some questions, and there'll hopefully be a chance for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, but do please keep them to be questions rather than extended points. And we'll then have closing arguments from 1 speaker from either side, and we will vote again. And my only final rule is that, can I ask the speakers to avoid any mention of the size of any of the opposite hands of the opposing members. So, can I ask Fred Van Leeuwen to propose the motion? You want to vote first? I do. Can I not ask Fred yet, but can we now begin the initial vote? On the screen, you can see the way that you do that. 1 to agree, 2 to disagree. Do you agree with the motion? This House believes aid and philanthropy hurt public education. We won't vote. We don't have one. It's an anonymous vote, and it's for 10 seconds, and your last click counts. Okay, thank you. And now, can I ask Fred Van Leeuwen to propose the motion?
Mr. Speaker, let me start by asserting that the public school systems of the industrialized world are the most successful public enterprises ever, crucial to equity and in achieving the right to education. They are also an indispensable element of democratic society. If public school systems are to play their democratic role, they are to be financed domestically through equitable, progressive taxation systems. This is the only way public authorities, communities, and citizens can exert control over their schools and over the system as a whole. all nations deserve to have strong, effective public school systems providing free primary and secondary education, not depending on contributions from the private businesses and not depending on charity. Our debate today is not about being for or against aid. In fact, to achieve Sustainable Development Goal number 4, quality education for all, the international community has little choice but increase official development assistance apportioned to public education. So again, this debate is not about assistance, yes or no, it is about the kind of assistance. It's about its purpose. It's about the conditions attached to it. In the past 20 years, enrollment in primary education has sharply increased. And this is largely, to a large extent, the result of aid programs. However, close to 60 million children of primary age still remain out of school, and some 250 million are lacking basic reading and writing skills. And this too is, to a large extent, due to aid commitments not being honored and aid programs being too fragmented. For aid to be effective at improving quality and equality, the focus must be on building sustainable institutional capacity. Many countries suffer from an abundance of donors, all prioritizing different subsectoral projects, sometimes exporting their homegrown education policy trends. The development of education has to be systematic and has to be sustainable. And this can only be achieved when governments, education ministries are in the driver's seat rather than operating at the mercy of donors. Some of our African colleagues say that education and teacher policy in their countries no longer is determined by elected political leaders, but by international donor agencies, such as UNICEF, such as the World Bank. An example is the introduction of scarcely trained paraprofessionals in the early 90s in Africa, South Asia, and elsewhere. And that was designed to overcome teacher shortages. But in some countries, they simply replaced professional teachers who were seen as being too expensive. The result, the teaching profession was weakened and education quality suffered. Elsewhere, conditional aid resulted in increased class sizes and restricted autonomy and pay for professional teachers. Standardized testing, Mr. Speaker, is the latest spending fad for some donor countries. Testing toddlers in Africa has become quite popular lately, mainly benefiting the companies selling these tests. Very expensive tests, by the way. Today, millions of dollars go from school feeding programs that aid experts have told us have no significant impact on test scores to companies that administer those tests. Some donors have gone so far as to make their aid contingent on countries hitting cut scores. Results-based aid, they call it. Perhaps should we place our bets on private corporations or philanthropic foundations? I don't think so. The Global Education Monitoring Report estimates the cost of universal pre-primary, primary, and secondary education at $340 billion per year. At least half of that amount is to come from non-domestic sources. Studies on corporate funding to education estimate that some 500 million per annum could be generated from that source at the most. I think it makes much more sense to have them pay their taxes, to stop the widespread evasion of corporate taxation, which could generate more than all the resources we need to finance all sustainable development goals. And what about the generous gazillionaires? Some may advocate that we start lobbying the 62 folks who own as much wealth as the poorest half of the world's population for help. Imagine their waiting rooms. You see my point. But with all due respect, the fate of children should not depend on the generosity of the rich. The achievement of rights, including the right to education, is the sole responsibility of governments, which brings us back to the official development assistance, which, with all its shortcomings, is the road to follow. The Global Partnership for Education, established a couple of years ago, bringing national and international stakeholders together, may perhaps provide a model which can stop proliferation of education aid projects, which sometimes, as I have argued, bring more harm than help, and may also ensure more systematic and sustainable ways to have education quality and equality provided by strong public school systems within reach of all countries. Thank you.
Normally in the House of Commons we would have lots of shouting and booing through that, so thank you everyone for much better behaved here. Can I call on Charles Tapp to make the first reply?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would quite clearly, everybody has already noted that that my colleagues across the aisle here have already conceded the debate. The vote at the end should be very simple. Now, we all agree that education should open the world for every child. But at current rates of change, it won't be until the year 2111 that all children in sub-Saharan Africa will complete even just basic lower secondary education. That's 10 years of school. And unless that changes dramatically, it'll be the girls who get there last, with the poorest girls getting there a full 70 years after the richest boys. It does not take a mathematician to see that this pace of progress is unacceptable, and it is why the leaders of 194 nations signed up a new ambitious global goal for education at the UN General Assembly last September, to ensure that all children get a full 12-year cycle of quality education by 2030. Now, to be sure, we've seen encouraging progress since 2000. And my venerable colleague across the aisle has drawn attention to some of that progress. However, it is clear that it has only been the lowest hanging fruit where we've seen some of the progress being made. And the fact that there are currently 124 million children either not in primary or lower secondary school is a disgrace in today's world. And when it's close to 500 million children are not learning properly, that makes the disgrace even worse. It is clear that education globally needs more resources, more research, and it needs more innovation. Now, UNESCO estimates that the global community needs to provide $39 billion more dollars each year more every year to provide a full course of schooling, including secondary, to all children by 2030. That's $39 billion a year. That's what's needed from external sources. That assumes that governments themselves will be making significant increases in their domestic financing. So let's look at this another way. On average, it costs $1.18 a day in developing countries to provide a child with pre-primary, primary, and secondary education. $1.18 a day. 88% of this cost will be borne by partner countries themselves from their domestic budgets. There is a 14-cent gap per child that one is looking to the international community for. The question here is not whether aid is bad. The question here is that aid is going to be essential for a while. And the question is, how do we use that aid, that external financing from international development partners and philanthropy? Those 14 cents make all the difference between a girl attending school or not, for a teacher having 40 or 80 students in their class. Now, on our side of the aisle, we are not arguing, absolutely not, that education, even in the poorest countries of the world, should solely be financed by aid and philanthropy. That is not sustainable, that is not transformative, and it is under no circumstances does that reflect how the real world operates or should be operating. Poor quality aid, Mr. Speaker, rightly deserves a rough hearing in this House, as does poor quality private sector investment. But let's not make the mistake of tarring all aid with the same brush. Aid, when correctly targeted, can play a catalytic role in transforming a country's education systems and improve the overall return on investment in education. As my venerable colleague across the aisle has already conceded, aid has a very important role to play in seeking to improve government education systems. Education cannot be provided, as we know, without a solid and sound education system. Improving education systems. Systemic change is not flash. It is not very exciting. However, it is absolutely essential if it is not owned and if it is not driven by a government with a proper policy engagement from all actors within a country, leading to a good policy debate, good sector planning, and good implementation with sound data. And that means there needs to be internal accountability. It is about locking together financing, planning and policy dialogue, and mutual accountability to seek improvement in the sector, and with that, you will start seeing improvements in learning and improvements in equity within a country. And aid can. We contend that aid can indeed make a difference. We are, of course, delighted to hear that our venerable friends across the aisle have highlighted the model that the Global Partnership for Education is particularly professing, which is that partner governments are in the driving seat. We need to stop this fragmentation of aid. We need to bring all partners together behind a sound, financed plan owned by a government and accountable for all partners. We have to have accountability for good and poor behavior. It is interesting how it is often the partner governments who are often criticized, and it is not the international community and the donors who are criticized for their behavior. In the Global Partnership for Education, mutual accountability means accountability to everybody in supporting a government implement its own education system. And finally, Mr. Speaker, we need to remember the marginalized children in emergencies and protracted crises. Over 60 million children who are affected by conflict, who are refugees or internally displaced, who are always going to be needing additional support in their quest for a sound and complete education. Mr. Speaker, as on our side of the House, we contend that aid is a very important part of seeking to improve the quality of education through improved government education systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And we now call Joel Samoff to second the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My opponent began by saying we'd conceded the argument. I think he's got it backwards. He says aid is very important, but look at the history. There's been aid to education over the past half century. And at the moment we say more aid is needed and more aid is needed and more aid is needed. The history is miserable. Now at this point I invite you to cross the floor over to this side and join us because we've already won that part of the debate. I want to address two themes in my comments. The first is that foreign aid creates dependence, and that is a pretty systematically clear outcome of foreign aid. And the second is that the problems of foreign aid are structural and cannot be readily fixed by small adjustments. Yes, it's the case that more money is needed. The calculation, I think, is a substantial one, whether you use the figure for all of education or the figure for basic education. More money is needed for education in the poor countries of the world. And it's certainly the case that foreign aid has had some accomplishments. We can readily see examples of that. Foreign aid has provided textbooks in places where there are insufficient or inadequate textbooks. Foreign aid has installed computers that enable children to have access, or learners to have access to vast stores of information, and enable them to access the internet and global knowledge. Foreign aid has supported teacher education that has permitted extending and enriching teachers' professional preparation. So yes, foreign aid can help, but let's look again. Let's look at those examples and see what the longer-term consequences are. Yes, foreign aid can help, but foreign aid is regularly capricious. Funders change their minds about what they will support, for how long, and what they will maintain. As their priorities change, programs that are supported are not maintained long enough to reach maturity or to become self-sustaining. There's a fundamental mismatch between aid funders' time horizon, which is generally a year or two or three, and the time needed to implement serious education reform, which all of you understand often takes far longer than a year or two. Quite simply, funders are ready to move on long before education reforms can achieve their objectives. Yes, foreign aid can support education reform, but far too often aid undermines the reform that it starts out supporting by initiating support and then failing to see it through. Yes, foreign aid can help, but foreign aid also imposes its own ideas, which makes that help a burden. Foreign aid always carries with it notions of what is to be done, how it's to be done, who is to do it. Imagine if in my community someone came to the local Board of Education and said, here is what is to be taught, here is how you are to teach it. Think about that in your own community. None of us would accept that. But that is what foreign aid demands of its recipients. As it brings foreign aid, it brings ideas, it brings expectations, and it often brings sanctions for those who don't comply with the expectation. So yes, foreign aid can support education in poor countries, but far too often aid directs and determines, not helps. Foreign aid also regularly undermines local initiative. It offers solutions rather than strengthening recipients' ability to develop and implement solutions. So yes, foreign aid can help, but far too often aid is not enabling. Instead, aid disables. Aid creates dependence. In the short term, we can see some gains. In the long term, we see the dependence that is created. As I've said, the promise of foreign aid is dramatic. In April of 2000 in Dakar, in the second of the Education for All conferences, the foreign aid funders insisted that no country should be held from achieving education for all for a lack of funding. And if you then look at what's happened to foreign aid in the period since then, it has not met that commitment. It has not closed the gap between what is needed and what is available. Indeed, in the most recent period, aid to education has declined, not increased. If aid were to be serving its job, you should see an upward slope. In fact, you see stagnation and a downward slope. Let me turn then to the second theme, and that is that the problems of foreign aid are, in fact, pretty well known. I have a short list. I'll mention several. Aid is often too little and regularly too late. A large portion of external support does not reach the intended recipients. Often it must be spent on products, personnel, and services of the providing country. There's a very dramatic speech at an earlier moment by the Foreign Minister of Canada in which he was challenged on Canadian foreign aid, and he said to the reporter, no, young man, you've got it all wrong. Our foreign aid is a development strategy for Canada. External support regularly carries conditions that in practice impede its effectiveness. Foreign aid, as I've said, is capricious, dependent on changing circumstances and preferences in the setting of the provider of the foreign aid. Foreign aid also doesn't provide the assurance of stable and long-term support that is needed. The specified uses of foreign aid are often at odds with the objectives and priorities of the recipient countries. Foreign aid, often in its negotiation, that is, government-to-government negotiation, helps leaders ignore alternative voices and critics within their own countries. The foreign aid that is intended to serve the provider's national interests regularly props up unpopular, often undemocratic authoritarian leaders. I could continue the list. What's dramatic about that list is not the list itself, but the fact that we have known that for decades. That list has been compiled not just by academics, but by the funding agencies themselves. And what that tells us is that the problems are structural. They're not amenable to a fix of this sort or that sort or some other sort. They're far deeper than that. They require a transformation of the aid system. So what do we learn from a careful study of foreign aid to education over 5 decades? What we learn is that systematically, country after country, region after region, aid helps a bit and then breeds dependence. What we learn is that the problems of foreign aid, regularly listed, regularly described, regularly decried, end up persisting. They are deep, they're structural, and what's needed is not a small fix, but replacing the foreign aid system itself. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And now I call Tsitsi Maziyiwa.
Mr. Speaker, the problem before us is a very big problem and requires all hands on deck. My generation, your generation, that generation sitting at the back requires that we take the challenge that we face head on and have the confidence that we require to solve the problem. Over the last decade, the number of children, as you rightly mentioned, out of school has decreased. 2/3 more children were enrolled in primary school, and the gender gap between the boys and girls has improved. And yet, as you rightly said, an estimated 250 million children around the world still cannot read. They cannot write. They lack the basic arithmetic skills. Many of these children are in developing countries and without regular access to quality learning opportunities. Now, if we listen to your arguments, the danger we fall into is you take us back to the 1980s, the period of utter stagnation and tragedies. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I want to build upon the strong case that has been presented by my fellow speaker here. Very strong, very compelling, in that, firstly, aid, philanthropy, and the private sector, the kind of funding that it provides, fills a key financing gap, particularly in least developed countries. If we are going to achieve the ambitious targets that we've set collectively on ourselves in the Sustainable Development Goals, philanthropic and donor aid will play an important role in expanding primary and secondary enrollments, increasing educational attainment, and securing gender parity. Philanthropic aid serves as a catalytic role in helping us to develop alternative, new approaches, creative and innovative solutions that eliminate existing barriers to a quality learning experience and greater access. Philanthropic aid brings in creative tools and models that help us to close the gap. The reality is we simply cannot build enough schools and train enough teachers in order to meet the educational needs of future generations. Philanthropic support, unlike government budgets, provides us with the flexibility. It provides us with the opportunity to think big, to innovate, and to build towards long-term and sustainable solutions that will allow every child to have quality education regardless of their location or their economic status. Now, I want to share my own personal story, a personal connection to the topic that we are debating today. When our family started out in telecommunications business in Zimbabwe, the country then was gripped by HIV and AIDS pandemic. It might be a distant past for many of you in the audience, and also the tragedy may be something that is distant to you. But I'll tell you this. When it started, at first, it was every month. Every month, we would have to leave work and attend a funeral service for somebody in the community or for one of our employees. Then it was every week. And then it was every other day. It was a pandemic that was to spread across the whole region. And its greatest tragedy was that it produced in Zimbabwe alone 1 million orphans. It was out of this experience that my husband and I threw ourselves into education and devoted time, we devoted efforts in investing in Africa's future through education. We created the Higher Life Foundation in 1996. And over the past 20 years, we have supported scholarships for over 200,000 orphans and vulnerable children and highly talented scholars. It has become one of the largest scholarship programs on the continent. Thousands of these children have gone on to receive tertiary scholarships, not only in Zimbabwe, not only in Southern Africa, all over Africa and across the world. Why do I share this story? I share this story because I'm convinced that we can give access to children through education by 2030. A goal, a shared vision that we all buy into. 194 nations signed into the vision. The donor community signed into the vision. Individual children, teachers, families buy into the vision. Philanthropists have signed into the vision. Governments are committed to providing the financial support and the political will needed to overcome the challenge. The donor community, philanthropists, the private sector are weighing in with the financial resources that are so desperately needed to fill the gap of $26 billion. Most importantly, the teachers, the students, the parents are excited and determined to improve the quality of their education. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you to both sides. I'm going to ask a couple of questions myself, and then please do raise your hand after that, and we will try and take a couple for the audience as well. To the proposers as a team, would the world be a better place if Tsitsi's organization didn't exist? If Tsitsi's organization didn't exist?
I'm not sure either of us knows the foundation, her organization, well enough to answer the question. That wasn't part of the debate.
It's an aid organization, and so I'd like to know whether you feel the world would be a better place if Tsitsi's organization didn't exist.
The world would definitely not be a better place if people like my honorable opponent would not be there to help us all achieve education for all. However, I strongly believe that you are using the wrong instrument. It is clear that it creates dependency. It does not only create dependency with the children, but also with governments. We can give you examples of governments who are very happy with the philanthropic contributions made and already plan their budget in such a way that they can decrease the education budget thanks to you, while we are of the opinion that it should be considered the sole responsibility of national governments to ensure education for all children. But definitely, without you, the world would not be a better place.
Tsitsi, would you like to respond?
What excites me is to be able to see 200,000 children who, if we had not invested if we had not taken the risk, if we had not blocked our ears to voices such as yours that says aid has no impact and has no effect, we would not have the champions that we have built who are serving as civil servants, serving in the private sector, serving as teachers, and buying into that vision we have that come 2030, we must end extreme poverty.
This is where we jump in.
Please do.
I think no one has suggested that there's no role for private support and support to education. The problem is, what's the long-term consequence? The clear example is in health, where those who are providing assistance decided that ministries of health were doing a poor job, say with antenatal care. They created antenatal care institutions that did lead to a reduction in maternal mortality. It did lead to a reduction in infant mortality, and then they moved on. They moved on, and the consequence was that the Ministry of Health, having lost its staff to the new institution, was less well able to do its job. And in the end, it is the Ministry of Health and Health and the Ministry of Education and Education that is responsible for educating, for the health, for the education of the populace, and anything that undermines that ability over the long term harms the health of the people, even though some may, or the education of the people, even though some may have benefited in the short term.
So, Charles, aid can help in the short term, but in the long run, it's got serious structural failings, and we'd be better off without it.
I mean, this is like a logical thing. It's like making a statement that's saying, cars can be dangerous, so we're better off without cars. I mean, let's be sensible on this one. Have there been issues and problems with foreign aid? There have. I mean, our colleagues across the aisle here have come up with a list of sort of generic statements. I normally believe that when one is involved in debate, one is supposed to be working with facts, and statements are great. All right? Aid has a miserable history. All right? It's capricious, it is short-term, it's directive, it's disabling, it helps leaders ignore voices in country. Therefore, problems are structural and the aid system needs to be replaced. I mean, come on. That's hardly a compelling argument. It is merely a statement that says that there are some issues in the current aid environment. Correct. We completely agree with that. The issue is that if you are looking to see a long-term investment, an improved education system, one has to bring all of the resources and all the partners and all of the financing behind that system. This does not need a revolution. This just needs some really simple common sense. And I'm really struggling as to why one is having to sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater on this one. There is ample evidence that shows that if one is able to bring financing together collectively behind a strong education sector plan, it's what we do in many of the industrialized countries. If we bring financing together, if we have the private sector and the public sector and civil society, and we have proper social accountability in place, then we will see improvements and long-term improvements, and we avoid many of the problems that our colleagues have thrown out here with gay abandon like confetti, as if somehow that is a compelling argument as to why we should ditch aid in support of education. In essence, I agree. I agree completely with some of the issues which have been raised, but the answer, we are correct in a proposition in relationship to our response, as opposed to what I consider to be cynical negativism, which is just throw it all away.
And
I think that the honourable opponent has not really understood our proposition. We are
No,
not.
I haven't. I am completely
We are
honest.
not.
There
We
is no
are not.
proposition.
We are not favouring ditching aid. Not at all. We want a better system. We want a guarantee that the international community works together to ensure a systemic approach of it. And it's not happening. You're saying that it will happen. You use the word will. Well, we hope that it will happen, but we are not confident that it will. I had very recently a conversation with your education minister at a conference of the Zimbabwe Teachers Association. I asked him situation in Zimbabwe and what he was going to do, and he told me, I don't know, because I do no longer run the education ministry. It's the donors that run the ministry. That's what I mean when I say that this is wrong. That kind of aid hurts the public school system. If even the education minister has no say any longer over what should be done and what should not be done.
Okay, sit, please. Yeah.
If I were an education minister with no budget because of poor economic policies, I too would throw my hands in the air and say there's nothing I can do. The issue is not that the education minister is not able to make a decision. He does not have the resources. And we are saying, bring in the partners that are willing to work with you, direct you, the ministers, in giving them the right policies, the right support that they need. And the ones that have the resources on the table, it's not sufficient, are the donors and the philanthropists. And I believe that the ministers, although it's a difficult decision for them to make, to accept the counsel that they receive, they would rather have that and make progress for the person that needs to gain at the end of the day, that is the student.
You asked us, Mr. Speaker, in the beginning not to talk about hands and sizes of hands and all of that. What I hear from our opponents is a whole lot of bombast. You keep saying we've made a list and the list is general and the list is not good. But it's all confetti, you said. That's an excuse for not addressing the issues. The list is very concrete. If you think the elements in the list are wrong, you need to say what's wrong about them. The list has a long history, but we can't dismiss it by calling it names and throwing it out the window. I'll come back later with some more.
Thank you, Joe.
I just wish, since I've been accused here of bombast and not dealing with this one correctly, I wish to say something which may surprise my colleagues across the aisle. All right, I completely agree. We completely agree that education is the responsibility of a government. And it is a responsibility of the government to increase and provide as much resources as it can possibly do to the public education system. Indeed, in the Global Partnership, we require there to be a commitment to increased domestic budget expenditure in education. That is the absolute starting point under which we should be working. And I contend that I've been told that I'm talking about the future. I can give examples of places where one can see where you have external financing getting behind a country-led process, where the minister is indeed in charge and the government is indeed in charge, where you are seeing significant progress in terms of both learning, in terms of access, and in terms of equity. This is not a future promise. This is a reality.
You accept another rejoinder?
Of course. I hope no one from the audience wanted to ask any questions.
Our opponent talked about the difficulty the Minister of Education in Zimbabwe had because of lack of resources. It turns out when you do the calculation of spending on education, private spending on education in Africa is about half again as much as public spending. That is, the money that parents spend for uniforms, for lunch, for transport, for books, for pencils, and all the rest, as well as those parents who can afford to go to high-fee private schools, put all that together, that's half again as much as governments are spending on education, which says that African countries can finance their education systems if they collect their taxes, if they insist that those who are of high income, both individuals and companies, pay their taxes, then there are adequate resources within African countries to pay for the education system, and they need not depend on foreign aid for basic expenditures.
So there's no financing gap, Charles?
There need not be.
Over time, there need not be a financing gap. We're talking about a period between now and 2030. All right? Everybody understands the fact in many countries there is a requirement and then progress has to be made in terms of taxation systems and the way in which the public expenditure is made. But you talk to most ministers of finance, and most ministers of finance are going to tell you the problem that exists in putting domestic resources into the education system is that the system itself is very weak and there is very little accountability within it. The point here is, it is for the international community. It is the role with external assistance. It's to help work to improve those systems, to help countries themselves build and improve systemic change for the education sector. This is not easy. This takes time. It is not as if we can turn a switch and suddenly, you know, Africa or wherever is going to have the resources to be able to pay for public education for all. So over time, indeed, we should expect, under no question, we should expect to see a significant transformational change in terms of the public financing of education. That is an outcome that we are all looking to try and achieve. I am as one with my colleague across the aisle. Our difference is that he suggests you turn the tap off of external international assistance and somehow, magically, this one will occur. We are debating here today, my colleagues, unless you are in the wrong chamber, the fact that all aid, all right, is bad. All right? And we are saying no, that is not the case. So I'd be interested to know as to exactly what the terms of the debate are that our colleagues across the aisle are trying to argue, because they seem to be coming closer and closer to this side of the aisle. And I welcome them to come over and join me.
Okay, we are coming to the end of that section. We've got time then for one very quick question, and the gentleman there in the middle, as loud as you can, please.
I have a question for the proposers of the motion. You mentioned repeatedly that you're not against the principle of giving aid, number one. Secondly, you also mentioned that aid has gone down over time. You mentioned specific examples of how aid has gone down. So the failures that you mentioned, aren't they because aid has not been adequate enough, has not been consistent enough, has not been provided in the right way? So the failure is the absence of aid rather than the aid itself. That's my question. Can you please clarify on this?
Yes, it's the case that aid has been inadequate. Yes, it's the case that some aid has been useful. But the inadequacy is not a mistake. The inadequacy is not a puzzle. The inadequacy is not a lack of... we don't need to puzzle about why that's happened. Think about it this way. Most countries in Africa have been independent for 6 decades now. Our opponents are talking about turning the switch. If you walk into a dark room and you turn the switch, are you prepared to wait 6 decades till the light comes up? 6 decades is a long time for countries to get their finances in order and to be able to finance their own education system. And what aid has done, and that's the answer to your question, it's not just that it's been inadequate, but it has been disempowering and disabling. That's why a minister in Zimbabwe, that's why a minister in another African country says, we no longer have the ability to set the course of our education system because we are dependent on foreign aid, and the foreign aid carries with it conditions, expectations, constraints, and sanctions. And that's why foreign aid is a problem. It's not that foreign aid couldn't help, it could, but it hasn't. And in its current form, it generally makes things worse, not better.
Thank you. We'll now, I'm afraid, won't have any more time for questions from the audience. Sorry that we haven't. we're going to move on to wrapping up. And so could I ask Professor Samoff to join us again to wrap up in 3 minutes.
He has nothing to say.
You wish. Sometimes perhaps my students might wish as well, but it doesn't work that way. I would love to be able to say yes, 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 yes to most of the things our opponents have said, but in fact, they haven't answered the challenges we've posed. They haven't answered the challenges we've made about foreign aid. I think it's absolutely a powerful observation. Foreign aid has been supporting education in poor countries for at least a half century, and now we talk about how much more is needed. Foreign aid has supported capacity development. I work mostly on Africa. Every foreign aid scheme has capacity development built into it somewhere, and yet we hear in the current era that capacity is in short supply, and that every new foreign aid scheme needs to have money for capacity development. If foreign aid had been working, there should be capacity hiding behind every tree. There should be capacity in every field. There should be capacity in every corner. Africa should be exporting capacity, not importing capacity. But where is it? Where is it? And that's not an accident. Historically, foreign aid has limited its support to what are development expenditures in education. That is a small portion of total education spending. The research is very clear. Historically, it's 1 or 2 or 3% of education spending in poor countries. But in recent years, foreign aid funders are now doing what they said historically they would never do. They're paying the teachers. There are now 11 countries, by my count, in Africa where the foreign aid support to education is at least 20%, and in a few 50% of the total education budget. One that I know of where foreign aid is 45% of the total recurrent budget. So foreign aid is paying the teachers. How is that a sustainable system? What's even more dramatic about that is when I travel in Africa and I ask my colleagues, both those who are in ministries of education and those who work for the funding agencies, how this is to come to some other conclusion. Is there a weaning scheme, I ask? And no one wants to talk about it. That's a future too horrible to imagine. It serves the interests of the funding countries that there continues to be this dependence on foreign aid. And so what would an alternative look like? In the affluent countries of the world, we all accept the notion of redistributive education funding. We all accept the idea that a Parisian who pays taxes is responsible for the education of poor children in Marseille. I accept as a Northern Californian that my taxes pay for education of poor children in Compton and elsewhere. And if we're really serious about education for all, we don't need aid that is at the whim and caprice of governments. What we need is a globally redistributive education funding in which we all accept that as citizens of the world, we are responsible for the education of the children of the world. That I accept as a Californian that my taxes should support not only other Californians, but children in Bangladesh, in Senegal, in Tanzania, in somewhere else. What we need is not an effort to fix the aid system, but something to replace it that can enable us to achieve what I think is the shared goal, that is truly education for all.
Thank you.
So, we're all here today because we have a motion in front of us that this House believes that aid hurts public education. That has not been proved by our colleagues across the aisle. There is absolutely no basis, no burden of proof has been provided. Indeed, our colleagues across the aisle have said, oh yeah, aid can help. Yeah. They have said that they believe that aid is good when it is supportive of improving government-owned systems. They have argued against their own case. We have seen one member across the aisle who's put in a spirited defense of their proposition. And even he is firmly of the belief that it is absolutely right and real that, as coming from the wonderful state of California, that he himself would have a responsibility and a belief that he would be contributing to the development of education in many of the poorer countries of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Speaker, the question in front of us today is this House believes that aid hurts public education. We contend that that is not the case. We have said right from the beginning that poorly directed and poorly implemented aid can hurt public education. There are models out there which show that aid can indeed help public education. In the context of the Global Partnership for Education, where we bring all partners around the table, we have some interesting and important evidence and facts to be able to show. After partner countries join the Global Partnership, domestic financing for education within those countries increases by 10%. We are also seeing a strength of mutual accountability and social accountability, which is absolutely putting the microscope on some of the poor behaviour that our colleagues across the aisle have highlighted. And we are seeing a significant reduction in fragmentation. When the Minister for Education and the Minister of Finance in Ethiopia is able to turn around to the donors and say, no, we don't want your support in there, you can leave. We want your support here under a major program which is looking to increase learning in our country, because we are paying for teachers' salaries. We are paying for all of the infrastructure within our country. It is clear what is needed, and this is where we need your support. There are models which are effective and are proven where aid does not hurt public education. Aid truly improves and supports the longer sustainability of public education. I encourage you to vote against the motion and join us on this side of the aisle. Thank you.
Thank you. So there we have it. Can I just ask again for another round of applause for brilliant arguments from both sides of the aisle. It doesn't look like this is a question which is going to go away in a hurry. We've heard that some aid works, some aid doesn't work. At the moment, in aggregate, does aid, do we believe as a House that aid and philanthropy hurts public education? That's the question before us, and the question we're now going to have a second chance to vote on. So could everyone pick up your voting thingies? And this was what happened before. The 2/3 majority disagreed with the motion, and we're now going to begin the process of a revote to see whether you've been persuaded one way or the other after that 1 hour of thrilling discussion. 1 agree and 2 disagree. Please vote now. You've got 10 seconds, and remember, it's your last click that ends up counting. I'm afraid this motion before the House has been turned down. And I'm not sure whether that's a victory for either side, because it looked like we had a marginal movement during the debate towards this side, so well done for that. But equally well done for holding your own to retain that majority. Thank you all so much. I hope you've enjoyed yourselves. Enjoy the rest of the conference.